April 18, 1938, the day Superman crash landed in our world. Not in the cornfields of Kansas, but in the heart of Harlem. Not Clark Kent, but Jerome Jones. Here a black man impervious to bullets isn't celebrated. He's labeled the country's most dangerous secret, a living challenge to the order that polices his every move. The establishment doesn't see hope. They see a threat too powerful to control. Superman's greatest enemy was never just a supervillain. It was the weight of political power terrified of a black messiah. What happens when the world that created a hero refuses to accept him? Harlem didn't just hide the boy from another world. It raised him, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with something far more powerful: understanding. When the ship fell through the roof of a tenement building on Lenox Avenue, it didn't make the papers. No witnesses spoke up. No authorities came knocking. Because Harlem had long ago learned that when strange things happen, silence is survival. The woman who found him a widow, named Miss Thelma Booker, knew exactly what she was looking at. Not a demon, not a science project, a child. She wrapped him in a quilt stitched from Pullman Porter uniforms, called him Jerome Jones. He grew fast. He was strong before he could walk. By age 3, he could leap across rooftops. By 4, he could hear conversations happening blocks away. But Harlem adapted. Barbers saw the glint in his eyes and taught him how to listen more than he spoke. Jasmine at the corner joint taught him how to breathe between notes. The pastor down on 135th told him what power looked like when it was used with mercy. His abilities weren't just accepted, they were woven into the rhythm of the neighborhood. When Jerome accidentally melted a spoon in his hand, nobody screamed. They looked around, shut the blinds, and went back to their chess game. When he fell from a fire escape and floated gently to the ground, the old men on the stoop just nodded. That boy's touched, they'd say, touched by God. Because Harlem knew something the rest of America never did. A miracle isn't something to fear, it's something to protect. Jerome was never sent to school, but he was never uneducated. He read Baldwin by candlelight. He memorized Frederick Douglass' speeches. He learned about Nat Turner, Ida B. Wells, Paul Robeson, not as distant names in a textbook, but as ancestors in the fight. The streets taught him how to move. The church taught him how to forgive. The music taught him how to grieve. And Harlem? Harlem taught him how to hide. He didn't wear glasses, didn't fake a stutter. Jerome's disguise was cultural, emotional. He learned how to not be noticed, how to shrink his shadow, how to turn myth into rumor. And everyone around him helped. The landlady never questioned the scorch marks on his ceiling. The butcher always tossed in extra meat, no charge. The jazz club owner had a reinforced basement just in case Jerome needed to stretch out. They didn't worship him. They didn't exploit him. They just made room. And when he drew the symbol on his chest, he didn't choose the S for Superman. He drew Sankofa, the West African symbol that means go back and get it. Because Jerome knew that his future wasn't just written in stars. It was written in struggle. He wasn't here to be a savior. He was here to reclaim everything that was stolen from his people, from his story, from history itself. You see, Clark Kent was taught to hide his powers for the world's safety. Jerome Jones was taught to hide his for his own. In Kansas, a boy from another planet was raised to be a symbol of hope. In Harlem, a boy from another planet was raised to be a secret that the world would never be ready for. And in that difference lies everything. Not every Superman is given the freedom to fly. Some are raised in the shadows, not because they're dangerous, but because the world is afraid of what might happen if they ever stood in the light. For a while, Jerome Jones was just a whisper. No photos, No footprints, no costume. Just a name kids passed around when someone did the impossible. A whisper that moved faster than the subway. A rumor wrapped in jazz riffs and streetlight flickers. They called him the ghost of Lenox Avenue. No one ever saw him land. No one ever saw him leave. Just the aftermath. A child pulled from a burning building. A runaway train stopped just before the platform. A corrupt landlord strung up by his ankles on a lamppost, still breathing, but singing a different tune. The cops didn't believe it. The press didn't know what to do with it. The government pretended not to hear. But Harlem knew. They knew the boy they raised had become something the world had never seen before. A god in exile. And gods don't stay secret forever. It happened on a summer night, one of those sweltering ones, where the heat feels personal. A fire broke out in a walk-up on 137th. 5 kids trapped on the top floor. Firefighters stuck in traffic. No time, no plan, no hope. Until he appeared. Not with a cape, not with a logo. Just jeans, boots, and eyes that saw through smoke like it was glass. He leapt 5 stories like it was a curb, burst through the flames, and carried each child out, one by one. Someone caught it on camera. A grainy reel from a reporter who just happened to be nearby. The next day, the front page read, "Harlem's Miracle or Menace?" The photo showed Jerome midair, a child in each arm, the fire hallowing behind him like he was born of it. And that's when the whispers stopped being whispers. The president was briefed. The Pentagon started running simulations. Hoover put a new name on his list. Not a communist, not a spy, but something they feared even more. A black man America couldn't control. Publicly, the government denied everything. Privately, they prepared for war. They dubbed him a threat to national confidence. That was the phrase they used, national confidence. Like hope had a color code, and Jerome didn't fit it. Meanwhile, the myth of the ghost exploded. Churches called him a sign. Activists called him a symbol. Kids started drawing Sankofa symbols on their backpacks. Teachers told stories they weren't supposed to. Musicians started slipping his name into lyrics like a prayer. But not everyone was grateful. Conspiracy shows painted him as an alien invader. One paper called him a space-born Malcolm X. Commentators argued that if he were truly a hero, he'd go through the proper channels, as if any channels had ever been built for someone like him. And Jerome? He just kept showing up. Quiet, reluctant, consistent. He saved people who hated him. Helped cops who'd pull him over if he weren't flying. He never retaliated, never lashed out. But every time he took to the sky, a question hung in the air, heavier than the heat. What happens when power doesn't come with permission? He wasn't seeking glory. He wasn't looking for applause. He was doing what Harlem taught him. Protect your people. Stay humble. Move silent. But the world was getting louder. The whispers had become headlines. The government had taken notice. And the man who had always belonged to Harlem was now being claimed or targeted by everyone else. He had become more than a myth, more than a miracle. He had become a mirror. And what people saw in that mirror scared them. Because Jerome Jones wasn't just flying over rooftops. He was hovering over everything America had tried to suppress. And in that moment, on that burning rooftop, caught in that photograph, he stopped being a ghost. He became a threat. Once the government gave Jerome Jones a name, they gave him a number. Case hashtag JX-17. They didn't call him Superman. They didn't call him alien. They called him a potential destabilizing force. That's how Jerome learned what kind of threat he really was. Not for what he'd done, but for what he might do. The ghost of Lenox Avenue had become a file in a locked cabinet at the Hoover building. The FBI called it Project Vigil. The goal? Observation without engagement. But behind closed doors, they asked harder questions. What happens if he aligns with civil rights leaders? What if foreign powers offer him sanctuary? What happens if he speaks out during an election year? The scariest part wasn't that he could fly. It was that he could influence. They tapped phones in Harlem, put federal agents on rooftops, infiltrated community centers and churches anywhere Jerome might return. Some nights, helicopters flew over Lenox Avenue with no explanation, low and loud, hoping maybe he'd flinch. He never did. Jerome had already learned from Harlem how to disappear. And now he had to learn how to endure. Because surveillance isn't just a lens, it's a weight. And the pressure to not become the monster they feared was crushing. Still, he kept saving people. He pulled a drowning ferry from the East River. He stopped a bridge collapse after a fuel truck exploded in Brooklyn. No press conferences, no demands, just action. And every time he did, the headlines bent further against him. Vigilante oversteps again. Mystery super threat disrupts first responders. Where's the accountability? You could save 100 lives. But if your face didn't fit the frame, you were still the problem. Back at the FBI, Hoover kept asking one question. Who raised him? They wanted to believe Jerome was a fluke, a malfunction, a failed weapon launched from somewhere else. But deep down, they feared the truth, that Jerome Jones was raised on American soil, by American hands, and still had no reason to trust it. So they tried to build their own. Not another Superman, a counterbalance, a licensed protector, someone in red, white, and blue, someone who didn't make senators uncomfortable. It failed. Their prototype couldn't hover for more than 30 seconds. His strength cracked his own bones. And worst of all, he hesitated. Because power can be manufactured, but purpose can't. So instead of building a better man, they tried to break the one they had. They leaked fake files accusing him of inciting riots, planted rumors in Harlem that he was a government plant, even staged a bombing in D.C. just to see if he'd show up, and when he didn't, they blamed him anyway. Jerome became a political Rorschach test. To some, he was hope with a human face. To others, he was a warning siren dressed in human skin. One senator called him a ticking bomb with a clean conscience. One night, Jerome returned to Harlem. Not to hide, but to remember. He landed quietly on the roof of the same building where his ship had first crashed. Below, the block had changed. Neon signs replaced street lamps. Gentrification pushed the old shops away. Kids didn't recognize him anymore. But Miss Thelma was still alive, still waiting in her chair by the window. She didn't say a word when he landed, just nodded toward the stove and said, "I made greens." And for a moment, Jerome wasn't a threat. He wasn't a headline. He was home. But even home couldn't save him from what came next, because the government wasn't done labeling him. Now they had a new term, unregistered supernatural asset. 3 words that turned a myth into a military target. Because the world doesn't fear monsters. It fears the ones it can't control. And Jerome Jones? He was never supposed to be one of theirs. If you want to hear more stories about Jerome, hit that like button. If we get 100 likes, we'll make another video. Jerome Jones was never invited to be a hero. He wasn't given a day job at a newspaper or a secret fortress in the Arctic. He didn't have an origin designed for hope. He had one built for survival. But that never stopped him. He kept flying, not for credit, not for fame, but because somewhere out there, someone needed saving. And he remembered what it felt like to be unseen. He was never just a symbol, never just a ghost. He was a question the world still doesn't know how to answer. What if the greatest hero of all time was someone America refused to believe in? If this timeline made you think, really think, then imagine the others we haven't explored yet. What if Batman was poor, What if the X-Men marched with Martin Luther King? What if Wonder Woman was Haitian, born during the Revolution? Hit subscribe, ring the bell, because in every twist of history, there's a version of the story no one told you. And here on Quantum Trails, we're just getting started.